Good afternoon. It's an honor for me to be here to talk to you about some of the work that we are doing. Thank you, John, for the invitation. As John said, I work on actually a wide variety of different topics. So when John invited me and asked me what am I going to talk about and send him a title and an abstract, it took me a long time to decide what should I be talking about, because we have been working on quite a large number of different things, some more related to atmospheric processes, such as lately I was leading a field campaign in California looking at atmospheric rivers, trying to improve understanding of atmospheric rivers as well as how aerosols from long-range transport may be affecting the amount of precipitation that we would get from atmospheric rivers. And we also work on a large number of other topics, including all the way from hydrologic modeling to tropical forests. And I was mentioning to some of the folks I met with today that we started a project looking at tropical forests and asking the question of whether tropical forests will remain a carbon sink in the future. And we are going to improve modeling of the hydrological processes in tropical forests to better help us predict their response to warming and drought in the future, and whether there may be vegetation die-off and mortality that would affect their carbon, the carbon sources and sinks. So in any case, so at the end I decided to talk about this representing hydrologic processes and the interactions in Earth system models. So a lot of the research that we do are indeed at the interface of the atmosphere and land. And more often than not, we are looking at things that are a bit more larger scale, hoping that we would be better able to understand how, for example, environmental changes and climate change may affect certain systems in the future. So with that, let me introduce my team. So I work with two teams. One is a group of scientists, mostly in atmospheric research that I work with, but I'm mostly introducing you to my other team, which is a land team that I work with, where we have been working on a range of different processes and modeling related to hydrology. So some of the folks you guys might have met over the years when you interact at AGU or some other meetings. Let me motivate the talk a little bit first. So we are trying to essentially model regional water availability. So understanding that there might be climate change in the future and a warmer temperature and things like that would cause a large change in not only the global average water, but also regionally, what might be the changes in water available for use. And so for that, of course, an important part of this is really asking the question of about precipitation, because precipitation is a major driver of water availability. But besides precipitation, what it really matters is, in fact, the terrestrial water that is available in the form of soil moisture, runoff, snowpack, and groundwater. So these are, in fact, the water storage that we can actually use, that they are on the ground, so we don't directly use precipitation. So what is important for us to know is really the precipitation minus evapotranspiration, which is the net precipitation that we can actually use, store in various forms on the ground. And so we are interested in understanding like how the seasonal and annual P minus E may change in the future. And then we also wanted to know like how terrestrial water may be partitioned among these various storage, right? So how much of that would be in the form of soil moisture, which could mostly be used for agriculture, whereas runoff could be used for many other purposes. And then lastly, we also motivated to understand like how or whether we may be able to manage the water system to meet water demand with the changes in the supply in the future. And in fact, not only water supply may change in the future, we expect that water demand would also change, partly because of changing population, but partly also because of changes in agricultural system, etc. So one of the last examples that I'm going to show you today, based on our modeling work, is exactly answering this type of question, like how may water demand and supply change, and whether we will still have the ability to meet the demand with the supply. So before I go into the modeling, I want to again motivate this a little bit more with the fact that why are we worrying so much about changes in the future? For now, we have already a pretty robust understanding of how the global hydrological cycle may change through a lot of modeling studies as well as data analysis and things like that. We know that globally, if you are looking at several different variables that are really important, right? One variable is water vapor. The other one is precipitation. But more importantly, oftentimes we would like to know about extreme precipitation. So in terms of global average, we know that these three quantities roughly scale with the degree of warming that we are going to experience in the future. For each degree of warming, we expect that the water vapor may increase by about 7%. And this is mainly due to the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship. But not all of the increase in the water vapor will result in changes in precipitation. And we have a pretty good understanding now that because of the energy constraint on the water cycle, only about 2% of this 7% increase in the water vapor would result in increase in precipitation per each degree of warming in the future. But when we look at extreme precipitation, most of the models are telling us that globally, we expect extreme precipitation. You may be talking about a 99.99 percentile of precipitation, may be increasing at a rate higher than 7% per each degree of warming. And so these are like pretty robust understanding that we have now. But again, these are like global averages. But what we really wanted to know is really regional changes, right? And in terms of regional changes, it is not so easy for us to come up with this kind of simple scaling, like 7% per degree or 2% per degree. So there's a lot of factors that we still need to consider, and there's a lot of uncertainty in really predicting how the regional hydrologic cycle may change in the future. And so this is a graphics that show from some of the studies showing these 2% per degree of warming in changes in precipitation and 7% for the water vapor. And for extreme precipitation, it is showing more or less almost like up to 15% increase in the extreme precipitation. At the same time, not only that we might expect extreme precipitation to increase in the future, there are a lot of arguments that support the fact that potentially drought may also increase in the future. And the reasoning for this is rather simple. It's mainly because land and the ocean are not expected to warm at the same rate. So we know that the ocean has a much larger heat capacity, so the land is going to warm much faster than the ocean. But also, the ocean has the capacity to provide a lot of water vapor, whereas over land, we have limited soil moisture. So not only that the warming would be larger, but there would not be so much water to be evaporated to cool down. And therefore, the water vapor deficit is expected to increase a lot more over land compared to over the ocean. And this increase in the water vapor deficit may be driving to larger changes in to drought in the future. So these are really some of the questions that we are trying to understand, like how floods and droughts may be changing and whether we will still have the ability to meet water demand in the future. So besides changes in climate that would affect the water cycle, we are also very much concerned about human activities, right? Because the human activities have more direct influence on the water cycle. For example, if we look at the global distribution of reservoirs, as well as the global distribution of irrigated area, over the US, we clearly see large areas that are relying on irrigation for crop production. And we also have a large number of reservoirs in the US. And even in many other countries, such as India, relying a lot on groundwater use for irrigation. So this would have direct impacts on the water cycle. And right now, we have these statistics here showing like 2/3 of the rivers are regulated by dams. And they store about like 15% of the total annual river runoff worldwide. So how do we account for this, and what would be the impact on evaporation from the surface? And at the same time, when we are looking at irrigation, because of this extensive irrigation activity going on, there has been studies that show that irrigation and deforestation have comparable but opposite effects on water vapor flows from land to the atmosphere. Right? So essentially, most studies would suggest that deforestation would decrease evapotranspiration going to the atmosphere, whereas irrigation may increase it. So if climate models account for deforestation but do not account for irrigation, then we would be missing an important part of this picture to understand how the water cycle may change in the future. So these are some of the questions that we are asking. At the same time, we also know that changes in surface processes such as evapotranspiration have an impact back to the atmosphere because there are these so-called land-atmosphere interactions. So this study has already been well cited, published in 2004, showing in a number of different regions, such as over the central US, part of the Amazon, as well as in the Sahel. These are some of the so-called hotspots of land-atmosphere interactions, meaning that if you change the amount of evapotranspiration coming from the surface, it might have a larger impact on precipitation because a larger fraction of the moisture supplying for the precipitation actually comes from local evapotranspiration rather than moisture transported from another location. So these are, again, motivating why we need to better understand these. So in order to answer these kind of questions, so essentially one of the overarching questions that we ask is really what are the vulnerabilities of energy, water, and food to changes in climate, as well as like the mean climate condition, the variability, as well as the extreme climate condition. So the approach that we use is essentially to develop model or improve upon existing models so that we can better model these land surface processes, river routing, as well as water management, because as I mentioned, human processes are also important, not just like natural processes. And then we also incorporate these models like called integrated assessment model that now include water component so that we can introduce both human processes as well as natural processes in the same framework to allow us to really address these kind of questions of vulnerabilities of the energy, water, and food system. And then we would use our models to perform numerical experiments to explore like what are the main interactions between these kind of human and natural systems. You know, what are the dominant pathways of the interaction? And we would perform simulations using sometimes offline simulation, not fully coupled, but sometimes fully coupled, and then try to get at some of the answers at what might be the implications if we wanted to mitigate climate change. If we wanted to mitigate climate change and cutting down on greenhouse gas emission, would it necessarily improve in terms of the water deficit in the future? So these are, again, some of the questions that we ask. So in terms of the areas that we focus on for model development for Earth system model, we have been focusing on a number of areas indicated here. So we wanted to represent what we call the integrated water cycle in Earth system models. By integrated, what I mean is that we integrate water cycle processes from atmosphere, from the terrestrial system, from the ocean, etc., but also integrating between the natural processes and the human processes. And so we try to improve hydrologic representation. In the land surface model, we add representations of human influence, and then we couple these systems together. And then we also inform the model with data to constrain the model parameters, because oftentimes you introduce a lot of complexities to your model, and then you have a lot of uncertainties in the parameters, like what should they be, especially globally. So we develop methods called uncertainty quantification methods that we use to constrain model parameters using observation data. And then we also use observation data to evaluate models and then quantify the uncertainty of the system. So looking at a lot of these different processes, obviously there are a lot of challenges in how do we actually go about improving these processes. And so oftentimes we have to ask ourselves, how do I balance model complexity with model resolution? I mean, the more processes you want to introduce into the model, and then those processes maybe can only be represented at higher resolution because those are like finer scale processes. So at the same time you increase complexity, you might also have to increase like resolution. So how do you really balance these? And then, but what about the data requirement? You wanted a very complex models, but do you really have the database to provide the input for your models? So these are also like very important consideration for us to look at in terms of balancing and come up with an approach to really represent these kind of processes. And we also wanted to develop a model structure that is amenable to future development. Don't develop a model that is good for now, but it would be very difficult to change in the future when we wanted more additional capabilities or something like that. And then also, how do we facilitate the use of observations to constrain the model and quantify uncertainty? So these are some of the challenges that I would sometimes highlight as I go through some of the improvements, the so-called improvements that we have implemented in the model, and then we can hopefully have some discussion and exchange about that. So a large modeling framework that we have been working with is a product of actually a larger number of people than what I showed earlier. across the laboratory. We developed this modeling framework, and we now call it Platform for Regional Integrated Modeling and Analysis. We call it the PRIMA framework. So within this PRIMA framework, we essentially have 3 types of models that we are looking at. On the left-hand side, we are looking at so-called Earth system models. So these are the models that we represent mostly like natural processes in the atmosphere, the ocean, and the land, etc. We have regional scale Earth system models. We also have global scale Earth system models shown in the bottom here. On the right-hand side, we have another type of model, which are mostly representing human systems. So these are so-called integrated assessment model. So they represent socio-economic factors, GDP. They represent the energy economics in the future, what kind of energy technology, driving changes in water and energy use, etc. And so these are like relatively coarse scale type of model that now we are using to help us simulate, for example, water demand into the future. And then in the middle, we have a large number of models we call sectoral models. And these are typically applied at pretty high resolution. They represent different parts of the so-called energy, water, land nexus. And so we have, like, for example, models of agriculture, model of building energy use, etc. And so these systems could be like one-way interactive or two-way interactive. And I'm going to show you some examples of how we improve some of the representation within specific models, and how eventually we use some of these models to really link up and then answer some of the questions that we are interested in. So just to drill down a little bit from this previous figure that I showed you, so we have this, again, regional Earth system model, integrated assessment model on the right-hand side, and then we have this sectoral model where we have land surface model, river routing model, as well as water management model. So some of you may already be familiar with some of these models, such as the community land model is the one that we use a lot for representing land surface processes. And we have recently developed a river routing model called Mozart, and as well as a water management model. And all of these can be run at local scale or can be run actually globally. We have the database to run all of these models globally at resolution ranging from about 1/16 degree to about 2 degrees, depending on what's the need of using the models for. And so the first thing that we started looking at these models to see like how well these models perform and whether there might be ways we can make the models work better is two studies that we have recently published in 2014, where we were asking a very simple question. In Earth system models, most of the land surface models, we kind of break up an area into like rectangular grid cell. So an area may be made up of a large number of rectangular grid cells, usually following the latitude and the longitude. And you might be running your model at multiple resolution like this. But we know that hydrologists have always wanted to run their model kind of like in a watershed kind of scale, right? So they run their model over watershed rather than over these latitude, longitude kind of boundaries. And so we asked a very simple question. Does it really matter if I run my model this way using watershed boundary versus running my model this way using a simple latitude, longitude kind of rectangular grid? Would it help in any way using this type of approach? So in order to answer these questions, we perform a set of numerical experiments using the same model. So we do not change anything with the model, but simply apply the model this way versus apply the model this way. But in each method, we ran simulations at 4 different resolutions, ranging from 1 degree to 1/8 degree resolution. And we do not compare our simulation with observation because we know that our parameterizations always have some limitations. So if the models aren't doing so well compared to observation, it may not be due to differences in how well you represent these kind of things, or is it related to the runoff parameterization themselves. So we use the very high resolution simulations, which is 1/8 degree, as our truth. So we compare all of these coarser resolution simulation to the very high resolution simulation to see, can I reproduce the answer of a very high resolution simulation by using coarser resolution? And if my answers do not deviate too much across resolution, then it means that my model is less sensitive to model resolution, which is a good thing. We always wanted our model to be not so sensitive to model resolution, right? So this is essentially what we are doing, is to compare each of the coarse resolution simulation with high resolution and do the same thing over here and see what happens. And so these are the results that we found. And so here we were looking at the absolute mean error when we compare the rectangular grid versus the watershed grid at a 1/4 degree resolution compared to the highest resolution. And then here the same thing, rectangular grid and watershed grid comparing 1/2 degree to the highest resolution, and then the same thing comparing the 1 degree to the highest resolution. So first of all, what you can see is if you go to the coarsest resolution, 1 degree compared to the highest resolution, of course we should expect the mean absolute error to be larger, and this is indeed the case. So these bars are typically larger than the bars over here. But interestingly, what we found is that for each resolution, going from a rectangular grid to a watershed grid, you always get a reduction in the mean square error, suggesting that if you use a watershed boundary, you would be able to reduce your error and be able to reproduce your answers at the very high resolution without going to such a high resolution. So what we say is that the model becomes more scalable. It becomes less sensitive to model resolution when we go to this watershed approach. And partly, we identify 2 main reasons for such an improvement in the model scalability because of using watershed boundary. Number one is that in terms of configuring the atmospheric forcing data, we find that atmospheric forcing data is sensitive to topography, obviously. Having a watershed boundary is essentially a way of defining your computational unit by topography, which is the way you bound a watershed boundary. And because of that, because atmospheric processes are actually more scalable by topography, and therefore it gives us the improvement in terms of the simulation. And secondly, the runoff parameterization itself depends on topographic information. So we were using particularly a runoff parameterization called a top model, and that one uses a topographic parameter called Fmax, which relay the subgrid topographic information to the saturation fraction. And that parameter apparently is also much more scalable when you go to use a watershed approach compared to a rectangular modeling approach. And therefore, this motivated us in the future that in community land model, we would be using this kind of watershed boundary rather than the latitude-longitude grid for our modeling. The next thing we did was to then look at the runoff parameterization. So for that, we have compared 2 different ways of representing surface and subsurface runoff. One is the top model approach used in the CLM model, and another one is a very popular approach called the WIC model approach, and we compare these 2. And what we found is that by using the WIC runoff parameterizations, which depend essentially on 2 critical parameters, and if we have a way of really calibrating those parameters based on observation, we were able to essentially improve the simulation compared to the observed runoff by quite a bit. And so this is showing the error between using the WIC simulation compared to observation versus the original CLM using the top model parameterization result in large errors in the runoff, especially in wet areas such as the Sahara and the Amazon region. And lately, we have started looking at, so what might be the implications of using these 2 types of parameterizations on the carbon cycle? And so we performed numerical experiment globally, just using exactly the same model. Everything is exactly the same except for using 2 sets of surface and subsurface runoff parameterizations. And so essentially what we were looking at is by using different runoff parameterizations, is an important sink term for the soil moisture, right? So if you change the runoff parameterizations, you would essentially change the soil moisture available in your simulation. And that itself would have an impact on the leaf photosynthesis. And as a result of that, it would directly impact the canopy GPP, which would then affect the carbon cycle. But we found another pathway of how soil moisture can also change the GPP, and that is by changing leaf photosynthesis, which then affect the evapotranspiration. And then by affecting evapotranspiration, it also actually goes back and affects the soil temperature. And this is actually a very important factor in the temperate region or the high latitude, where changing the soil temperature has large influence on the vegetation phenology, and as a result of that, it would also affect the canopy GPP. And so based on the 2 experiments, simulating using the Vic runoff versus the top model runoff, we were able to identify that there are like important changes, especially in different types of vegetation, mostly associated with the higher latitude, like over here, where when we look at the GPP difference, simply by using a different set of runoff parameterization, changing the soil moisture can result in large differences globally of 20% in the GPP. So that's a pretty important factor that we need to understand. So not only your way of representing the biogeochemistry would affect your result, but you also need to pay attention to the water cycle, because the water and the carbon obviously are really very much tightly linked together. And then now I talk about modeling the river processes. So here we have developed a model called Model for Scale Adaptive River Transport. We call it the Mozart model. So essentially, when we look at a real river network, it's pretty complicated, right? In a watershed, you might have these main river channel, but you have a lot of tributaries, and then there's a lot of runoff processes that are being routed at the hill slope scale. So there's no way we can represent hill slope routing process in an Earth system model. But those are important processes to represent, and therefore we have developed a way to conceptualize a real river network into a very simplified river network where we have hill slope routing into a very simple sub-network or tributary channel, and then routing to the main river channel. So each model grid cell would have a subgrid fraction of these hill slope area that would be routing water, as well as area routed with the tributary and then the main channel. So by doing that, we were able to use the diffusive wave method, and we're able to simulate river transport globally and compare with observation that actually performs quite well. And here we show, in fact, we were comparing our method with the typical approach used in CLM. They have already a river transport model called RTM. So RTM is a very simple river transport model using a constant channel velocity, whereas our method essentially can simulate a dynamic river channel velocity. So everywhere the river channel velocity can be different depending on the topography, the structure of the channels and stuff like that, and it can also change over time. So in order to compare our method with this simple method, we can step by step revert our model back to something as simple as the RTM. So we would, for example, not allow any variation in the river channel velocity spatially, or not allowing the river channel velocity to change temporally, etc. At the end, we would come down to something almost the same as an RTM, and we would then evaluate what are the impacts of using such a simple model compared to a more sophisticated model in terms of simulating different quantities, such as like annual maximum flood. And we found that for this particular quantity of annual maximum flood, this is showing the observed versus the model simulated, and the different symbols over here show various ways of simplifying our model back to something almost like an RTM model. And we can see this is using the log scale. So by simplifying our method to the RTM, sometimes you can result in a difference of almost 1 order of magnitude difference in simulating the annual maximum flood. And then secondly, we also noticed that in some river basins that are highly managed, when we look at our model simulation of the stream flow, our model was obviously over-predicting stream flow, and part of it is because we were not accounting for the water being diverted for water use. And this then motivated us to really implement something in our model to represent human processes. So here we have incorporated or developed a water management model to very simply represent what's the function of reservoir operations. So essentially the function of reservoir operation is to store the water when you are not needing it, and then store it for time when you need it, for example, in the summer for irrigation. And also you wanted to draw down on the reservoir in the wintertime, in the rainy season where you might have a chance of flooding, so that you can have room for more precipitation when the flood comes. And so accounting for these two ways of managing the reservoir, we were able to actually simulate, for example, the representation of over 1,800 different reservoirs in the US, and then including the rules for both irrigation and flood control. We were able to simulate, for example, over the Grand Coulee Reservoir in Washington State, in the Columbia River Basin, we were able to simulate the timing of the reservoir level really well when we combine the two uses of water in that area. So now with this suite of models that I talk about, we first want to determine, do these models really give us reasonable answer or not? Right? So one thing we wanted to do was to evaluate them. And one example over here shows some of the model evaluation work that we did, highlighting two specific years. One is a really drought year in 2012. There was a big drought in the Midwestern US. In fact, this figure here taken from a paper that I was a co-author on, looking at the 2012 drought. If you look over from even from the pre-industrial time all the way to here, looking at the precipitation deficit, the 2012 drought in the Midwest, in fact, in terms of the magnitude of the precipitation deficit, is way beyond any of the previous record and even beyond the Dust Bowl period. Although, interestingly, the Dust Bowl period is not a single year that has a lot of precipitation deficit. It's multiple years with precipitation deficit that is causing the Dust Bowl, whereas this one is a single year of really big drought, large precipitation deficit, but only occur in 1 year. And in this paper, we kind of explain some of the large-scale features that was causing this particular drought in that year. So we try to simulate this year and then pick another year which is more or less kind of like normal year, which is 2009. And so this year has large precipitation deficit and very high warm anomaly, causing this kind of drought condition. So when we look at observation, looking at the precipitation deficit, runoff, soil moisture, and temperature, they all indicate that during the summer of 2012, there's a lot of lack of precipitation, lack of runoff, lack of soil moisture, but significant increase in temperature. So we wanted to know whether our models are able to capture that. So I'm going to skip over that. So here we show the observed temperature anomaly and the precipitation anomaly comparing 2012 with 2009. And then this is the model simulated temperature and precipitation anomaly based on the Wolf model coupled to CLM. And overall, we found that at least the model was able to capture this warm temperature anomaly and also this precipitation deficit, roughly of the order of magnitude that is correct, although there are also some regional features that we weren't able to exactly capture. So having this information, then we propagate that kind of information to our land model, the river routing model, and the water management model, and see whether we can simulate the regulated flow, the difference between 2012 and 2009. So here, these are just showing examples over 4 different locations in the Mississippi River Basin. So the cool colors are 4 different simulations for 2009, and the warm colors are 4 simulations that we did, and sample simulation for 2012. And then these thicker lines are based on observation. So overall, we see that the model simulation, which are the lighter color, kind of like matches the observation quite well. These are like the regulated flow, not just the natural flow, but already regulated by the reservoir. Okay, so we see clearly that there is a big difference between the 2 years in that 2012, there's a big drop in the regulated flow in both of these 2 locations. But in these 2 other locations, not only that we are seeing a big drop in the regulated flow in the summertime, but there was also a shift in the peak to an earlier spring peak. And this is because these 2 locations are actually affected by areas that have snowpack in the mountain. And what we found is that this drought year of 2012, in fact, the springtime was already quite a bit warmer than a normal year. So that warm anomaly in springtime is actually leading to earlier snowmelt and probably contribute to the warmer and drought condition in the summertime. And so the model was able to capture this kind of shift as well as the change in the regulated flow quite well. So here we look at what we call water deficit. So when we compare water demand with water supply, and because in 2012 we do not have enough water for water supply, so we should expect the model should be simulating more water deficit. And we wanted to check whether that was indeed the case. So here we look at just the flow, the regulated flow simulated for 2009. And this is showing the ratio of the regulated flow between 2012 and 2009. Showing these kind of brownish colors are showing a smaller or ratio less than 1. So showing that the regulated flow in 2012 definitely lower than 2009 in most of the area in the Mississippi River Basin. And then when we look at the water deficit, comparing between supply and demand, in 2009, the model actually simulates a surface water deficit in 2 locations. And this is actually very reasonable because we know that in these 2 locations, this is the Ogallala aquifer. And in fact, the reason why we did not have water deficit is because we were pumping a lot of groundwater for use. And if you don't account for groundwater use, you should be actually getting a water deficit, a surface water deficit. And so, in fact, the model was able to capture that. And then over the lower Mississippi River Basin, that's also another area where groundwater use is extensive for crop irrigation, etc. And so now when we compare 2012 to 2009, we were seeing mostly this kind of yellowish brown color, again showing larger deficits. So the ratio is larger than 1 in this case. So the model captured the water stress in 2012 compared to 2009 in that case. And so now the next question we ask is, looking into the future, what might be the changes in water demand and supply, and etc. So one question that we were particularly interested in is, people have talked a lot about like mitigating climate change, right? So oftentimes when we look at mitigating climate change, we wanted to cut down on fossil energy use. But if you cut down on fossil energy use, but you have an increase in population, where do you get your energy from, right? So a lot of these so-called climate scenarios, essentially they look at different ways of producing energy using different methods. So there are 2 different scenarios that we often look at. One is so-called business as usual scenario. So in this business as usual scenario, we call it 8.5 scenario. We kind of like assume energy technology is about the same in the future with some incremental increased improvement and things like that. But pretty much the mix of different types of energy among nuclear, fossil energy, etc., is not too different over time. But in a mitigation scenario, we call it 4.5 scenario, there are significant differences in the mix of energy in the future compared to now. And a large part of it is related to, for example, the green part over here, a strong reliance on bioenergy production to supply for the energy when we cut down on the fossil energy use. So one question we ask is then, okay, is it really possible for us to really support bioenergy production in the future? We know that bioenergy requires water too, right? And so do we actually have enough water in the future to support this kind of bioenergy production? So when you look at, for example, the fraction of total area that is irrigated, right now in the US, a lot of areas is already irrigated. And a lot of them actually rely on groundwater irrigation too. And so in the future, for example, under global warming, if we have less water supply because of changes in the evapotranspiration, but then we have an increase in the water demand because we wanted to grow more bioenergy crop, what would be this kind of stress between the supply and the demand? So this is one question that we wanted to put our models to exercise to see what we can learn from that. So here is a climate change scenario that we use, simulated by the Wolf model versus global model. This is just an example showing you that models do project changes in water availability in the future. So this is precipitation minus evapotranspiration, the net amount of water that is available on ground. Models typically project different changes throughout different seasons. There is a lot of discussion, of course, related to the so-called mega drought of the future in the western United States or southwestern United States. And that one is actually mostly driven by wintertime and springtime features. And so with these kind of climate change scenarios, then we were putting our model to a test, and then we ran through our land surface model, river routing, and also the water management model. So here I show you the simulated water deficit for the current climate condition. As I mentioned before, our models do simulate water deficit, even though you might not think we don't have water deficit now. But as I said, we don't have water deficit because we are using groundwater. But if we don't account for groundwater use, in fact, these are all the locations that should already be experiencing water deficit. So the Ogallala Aquifer has a lot of extensive groundwater use. The Central Valley, extensive groundwater use for irrigation, etc. So this is what we simulated for the present time. And in fact, this map also almost matches the map of the fractional area that rely on groundwater for irrigation. Yeah. And then here we show the changes in the water deficit in the mitigation scenario versus the business as usual scenario over time, changes over time. We see that this yellowish brown color show larger water deficit. So what we see is that the mitigation scenario actually result in larger water deficit compared to a business as usual scenario. So this is kind of like surprising to us. Wow, I mean, we thought that mitigation should be mitigating everything, like reducing the warming, and obviously you do see a smaller warming signal in the mitigation scenario compared to the business as usual scenario. But that doesn't necessarily translate to less water deficit in the future. So to look into this a little bit more, so we perform this analysis, so-called water deficit hotspots. So we apply some technique based on these big data analysis technique that some of our colleagues in the computational and statistical science department. So they look at our data output. There's a huge amount of model outputs, and then they identify these deficit hotspots as a group of adjacent cells, each kind of having defined by a deficit threshold, and if it is like 95 percentile, then we call it a hotspot, but it has to be not a single point, but an adjacent group of points, then we count it as hotspots. And what I show here are the cumulative PDF probability density function for the two different scenarios for different river basins. So we see clearly, again, confirming that the mitigation scenario, which is the purple color over here, result in larger water deficit and therefore more deficit hotspots in the future. So looking at this a little bit more, so is it driven by changes in the demand or is it driven by changes in the supply? So here we provide four different curves over here. Again, the purple color is for the mitigation scenario and the green color is for the business as usual scenario. But now we look at solid circles versus open circle for demand versus supply. So what we see is that this increase in the water deficit in the mitigation scenario is mostly driven by the increase in the water supply, even though, in fact, by mitigating the warming, we, in fact, actually reduce the impact on water supply. So, in fact, water supply was actually getting better in the mitigation scenario, but the increase in water demand is so much in order to support the production of bioenergy crop that this is driving the increase in the water deficit into the future. So when we look over the different river basins, look over the changes in time, we see, of course, larger and larger increase in the water deficit into the future. But there is also an indication of a drop, kind of like after mid-century, most of the river basins show a drop in the water deficit in the future. And this actually is mostly driven by the changes in the population. So according to a lot of the population projection, in the US, there is a decline in the population after the mid-century. And so this is reducing some of the water stress in the future. So overall, we found these interesting results of mitigation not necessarily helping in terms of water stress. And one question we ask is, does it really matter whether we do our modeling at the kind of resolution that we did, which was like 1/8 degree resolution, relatively high resolution compared to some other studies that are typically done at 1 degree or coarser resolution? So to answer this question, we look at the so-called signal-to-noise ratio. So here the signal is the difference between the mitigation and the business as usual scenario. And the noise is the interannual variability. So we wanted to know how much can the signal emerge from the noise? And if we model using different resolution, can we get a larger signal-to-noise ratio or not? And this is what we found indeed the case. When we use coarser resolution model, like pink color, these are like really coarse 1 degree resolution versus like using high resolution model, the signal to noise definitely emerge much more, suggesting that unless you use a high resolution model to do this type of analysis, you may not be able to tell the difference between a mitigation or a business as usual scenario. And the reason is simply that you are now aggregating over a very large area. So whatever happened inside might be some area have water deficit, another area may not have, and things like that. And they may not necessarily be able to transfer the water, right? But in a coarse resolution model, then you just average out, and so you won't be able to see a lot of these water deficits that should be there on a regional basis. So what we found is that it's important for us to address this kind of question using higher resolution model. So overall, what we found is that we have developed this couple modeling framework capable of simulating regional scale features that allow us to really look at these nexus between this energy, water, and food. This is a very, very important topic for us and in understanding like the climate change impacts, as well as what are the implications if I implement certain mitigation strategy into the future. Does it necessarily help us in all aspects in terms of the mitigation. And the models we found reasonably capture the anomalous condition between 2012 versus 2009. And so that was a good sign. And then we applied the model to these future scenarios, and we gained some insights about the challenge of using or relying too much on bioenergy production, which could cause these water deficit or water stress in the future. So very quickly go over just another topic. So we have also implemented this so-called groundwater pumping for irrigation in our model to allow us to look at like what might be the impacts of groundwater pumping. Is it good or bad for the groundwater table? Is it necessarily causing a decline of the groundwater table? So with this modeling framework, we were able to simulate the changes in the groundwater table. We look at several different locations where there are extensive use of groundwater for irrigation. And we found that only over this lower Mississippi River Basin, in fact, because of the infiltration rate was actually quite high, we found that even with groundwater pumping, the groundwater table did not decline that much over time, whereas for most of these other regions with groundwater pumping, the groundwater table continuously declined because of that. And just one last thing to mention that we have since added new capabilities in our model. One of the capabilities we added was the ability to simulate this inundation in river basins. For example, over the Amazon River Basin, when we look at the wet season versus the dry season, the extent of inundation is very different. And you would expect that with this amount of water inundating the surface, it would obviously have an impact on surface evapotranspiration, surface albedo, and things like that that would affect the ability of land-atmosphere interactions in the river basin. So now with this capability of actually simulating these inundation, putting the water back to the land surface model to affect surface albedo, to affect soil moisture, etc., we hope to be able to address some of these questions related to surface inundation in the Amazon and the impacts on the land-atmosphere interactions. And we have also added capability to simulate stream temperature besides simulating stream flow, and recently also added sediment, and then beginning to work on this river biogeochemistry, so that within the Earth system modeling framework, the river would be performing all of its function in terms of closing the water budget, closing the energy budget, and also closing the biogeochemical budget. And because most Earth system models don't really account for these type of processes from rivers, because they are not like big sources or sinks, but they're still important, we believe, at least for some region and at least for closing the budget globally. So that's all I have. Thank you. I should.